Hi everyone. Today's topic is about general strategies when taking tests and exams. Oftentimes, when we are preparing for a test, we're so focused on the specific material it covers and the type of questions it's going to have that we don't think about the process and the structure of test taking as a whole itself. So, these are considerations that you don't necessarily need to prepare for each time you have a test, but they're good to review from time to time and assess your general test taking strategy to see where there can be improvements or advantages for you. This first one has to do with the time allocation per question. The default thinking about this is that your time allocation on a given test should be divided on the basis of the weighting of the questions in terms of marks. So, for example, if you have 2 hours to complete a test and the test has 3 questions, two of which are worth 25% of your mark, and the third question, which is worth 50% of your mark, then you would spend 30 minutes each on the first 2 questions and 1 hour on the last question. While this seems perfectly reasonable, the problem is that mark weighting does not always equate to the amount of thinking, effort, and time that the question requires. So, using that same example test from before, the first 2 questions are both worth 25% of your mark, but one of them could be significantly more difficult, burdensome, elaborate, detailed, such that one of them is actually much more time consuming than the other. And so, after spending your planned 30 minutes on the question, you're still not done and you're not sure whether you should try and continue to complete the question or leave it incomplete and try to get marks from the other questions. So then you might be wondering, if one question is much more time consuming than the other, why are they both worth the same amount of marks? Why would the professor do this? Well, they don't always do it intentionally. Professors have different ways for gauging how long questions should take for their students, and perhaps they might make assumptions about some things being easier or more difficult for students, and end up with a skewed sense of how long a question would actually take to do on the exam. On the other hand, sometimes it is intentional, such that the professor knows one question is much more time consuming than the other, but they have other reasons to make them worth the same weighting on the exam. For example, the importance of the concepts tested in the 2 questions relative to the overall course. Both concepts could be equally important to a student's understanding of the overall course, but one concept just happens to be a lot quicker to work through than the other, for whatever reason. Some professors are a little more nefarious, and they'll make the 2 questions worth the same amount to throw you off and confuse you about how much work is required in each. In any event, you can't magically know your professor's values regarding the weighting of your questions, but you can try and get a sense of their thinking about how they weigh these questions by looking at past year's exams from them. Look at how they've distributed the marks throughout the questions and try doing those questions in test-like conditions to see how long it would take you to do. Then compare the time it took you with the weighting that your professor gave. See if those match up. See what types of concepts or what types of questions the professor seems to give more time for and which ones the professor provides less time for in these tests. If for whatever reason you can't access any of the professor's past year's exams, you can always ask the professor during the course by showing them an assigned practice problem and asking them what would their expectation be regarding how long it should take in order to complete in an exam. What they'll tell you probably won't be a precise number, but you'll get a sense of their expectations. You can then use those expectations when it comes time for your exam, where after you read through a given type of question and see how many marks have been allocated to it, you can then figure out whether you should spend any more or any less time on that question based on what you know about how this professor weighs the questions. Another test-taking strategy to consider is the order in which you do the questions on the exam. Aside from questions that are multi-part in nature and build on a common premise or question, usually you're free to do the questions of the exam in any order you want. Most students, however, will just work on the exam in the order that the test was written, either on the assumption that it's the order that the professor intended them to take, or they are just simply indifferent about the order. But there could be advantages to taking a more hands-on approach in the order that you complete the test. For example, let's say you're doing a test for which you think you might be pressed for time, as in there are a lot of questions to do in a relatively short period. You might be better off trying to complete the longer, more weighted questions before doing the shorter type questions. The reason for this is that for those long-form questions, in order for you to get the marks, you have to do more thinking, planning, and showing your work. which you will have difficulty doing if you're being pressed for time at the end of a test. Whereas with things like short answer questions or multiple choice questions, they're not as difficult to do as time is expiring because you don't need to plan out an answer or show your work. You generally just provide the answer. Another sequence in which you might want to do the exam is in the order of the materials or concepts that you just kind of want to get out of the way. This is particularly relevant for exams that cover a lot of things and you've been studying for a long time. I would compare it to having to carry a bunch of things around for a long time. At a certain point, you just want to put the heavy stuff down. The heavy stuff here would be the concepts that you've had to memorize and are afraid you might forget, or it's the stuff that you covered most recently so it's the most fresh in your head. It's stuff that you just want to get out of the way first because of how you studied it or how you feel about it, so you do it first. There are other strategies that depend on your preferences as well, like trying to do a quick preview of the questions and determining which might be the hard stuff for you and which might be the easier stuff, and then again, depending on you, doing the hard stuff first or the easy stuff first. Now, aside from the order of questions, another test-taking strategy that really helped me out in university was doing quick rereads of the question and my answer after I had completed a page. The reason for this is that a lot of times in exam situations, we're so nervous that we just want to answer the questions as soon as possible. When we're reading a question, once we feel we have absorbed the minimum amount of information necessary from it, we just start trying to answer it right away. We're so anxious about making sure we have enough time to get through all the questions and so excited when we think we know something that the test is asking us that we just want to get it down right away. The problem is oftentimes in that rush of blood to the head, you might actually make a big mistake. You might actually interpret the question entirely wrong from what it's asking for, and so your answer will be wrong. So that's where these quick reviews of the question and answers come in once you've finished a page or so, where now, though you're still in a testing mode, you aren't as excited as you were when you were reading and thinking about the question. You're in this little pause or timeout, and in that clarity of headspace, you reread the questions and your answers to just ensure that you did answer what it was asking for, and you didn't miss any details or misread something in the rush to get it done. One of the things I also review is to make sure that my understanding of the question and my response would also make sense from the test maker's perspective, which is to say what the professor is trying to ask me with this question. What would be their expectations in terms of what's needed in a complete answer? Essentially putting yourself in the test maker's shoes to see if what you did makes sense. The last piece of advice I would say when it comes to test taking has to do with mentality. And with any mentality, it's not something that you can just adopt. You have to build it over time. And this is the idea of question independency, not getting emotionally invested into any one of the questions. You should conduct the test as if each question were its own separate test, which means that regardless of whether you're confident in an answer and feel the question is easy, or you think you don't know how to answer it and you think you might get 0 on a question, none of those feelings then follow you to the next question. Think about it like a basketball player. Whether he has missed or made his last 5 shots, it should have no bearing mentally on his ability to make the next shot. Now, of course, he can make adjustments based on what's happened in those last shots. For instance, if he noticed he wasn't bending his knees enough or not raising his elbows high enough, and you can do the same on a test. If you think you took too long to do a previous question or your previous answer wasn't well supported enough. But from a mental perspective, these should have no bearing. Mentally, you should have the same readiness for the last question of the test as you did for the first question of the test. Don't get emotional or excited about any one question of the test, and not even positively. This isn't about being positive, it's about being focused. Even if you did a great job on the last question, okay, great, but it has no bearing on this next question. Don't get cocky, it's a completely separate question. So these are a bunch of different tools that you can take with you whenever you do any exam, and try to find small but consistent, reliable advantages for yourself as you do them. I hope you found this helpful and thank you for watching. Please like the video and subscribe for more. Until next time.